All right, so just to keep track of where we are in the class, last week we studied chapter 11 and part of chapter 12, and then this week we're going to do the rest of chapter 12, and we'll cover chapter 13. And so just to kind of catch up on where we were last time, chapter 11 began with Jesus arriving in Jerusalem with his disciples. Prior to this, he had been teaching his disciples a new thing, that he must go to Jerusalem where he would be arrested, um, executed, and then that he would rise again. And of course, as we know, his disciples are having a hard time comprehending this. But they go to Jerusalem. We read last week in chapter 11 with the triumphal entry where Jesus takes his messianic act. He rides up towards Jerusalem, towards the Temple Mount on a young donkey, just sort of steeped in messianic symbolism as he does this. They arrive in Jerusalem, it says. They immediately go in and they look around the temple complex. So they go and see it, and then they leave. And then we talked about how in chapter 11 we get this story then of Jesus goes in and he cleanses the temple. And we talked about how that story is sandwiched between this kind of strange story about a fig tree, where Jesus comes along a fig tree looking for fruit, even though it's not the season for fruit. And because there's no fruit, when he came looking, he curses the tree, which ultimately withers and dies. And we talked about how you couldn't interpret what Jesus does in the temple without interpreting the fig tree incident alongside it, how they mutually interpret each other. And that when Jesus is in the temple and he's cleansing the temple, he's also quoting from Old Testament prophecy. Prophecies like Isaiah 56 and Jeremiah 7, or Jeremiah 6, that are dealing with the destruction of the temple. And this goes right along with the cursing and the destruction of the fig tree. You have this symbolic enactment of Jesus coming to the fig tree and coming to the temple, and he's looking for fruit and finding none. He enacts judgment on it. That resulted very much in his authority being questioned by the temple officials. And so we talked about that and how when they asked him his authority, Jesus pointed to John the Baptist and the baptism of John the Baptist, and how Jesus is the one that follows John. And how, of course, we know from Mark's gospel that when Jesus was baptized by John, he was anointed by God as the Messiah and as the Son of God. Then we talked immediately after that, it started in chapter 12, about how Jesus told a parable of the tenants that's very much based on a story in Isaiah chapter 5 about God planting Israel as a vineyard and finding no fruit, and the fact that God was going to take that vineyard away from them and give it to others. And in fact, that's the very point of Jesus' parable about the wicked tenants. And then we closed with a series of three questions that were posed to Jesus. The first, the one we talked about in class, was, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? And one of the things we talked about, Jesus' answer to that was, it dealt with the image and the inscription on the coin. And he said, well, whose image and inscription is it? Give that back to the person whose image that belongs. And the implication being, whose image and inscription is on you? God. He said, give all of that to God. So here Jesus is referring to a way that he's teaching that involves giving one's whole self to God, giving everything. Sort of, keep in mind we're in the temple, the ultimate sacrifice, if you will. So I've run through all of this again just to kind of point out that I think all of these stories are connected. And the connection of these stories, in my opinion, is going to continue through the rest of chapter 12 and into how you interpret chapter 13. So they're very much focused on what Jesus has come to Jerusalem to do and what Jesus is doing in the temple. And of course, we know we can't explain historically why Jesus died without talking about what he did in the temple. What he does in the temple directly leads to the events that cause his arrest and his trial and ultimately his execution. All right, so we'll pick up here in verse 35 through 37. All right, so here Jesus now, after being asked three questions, he's going to pose a riddle to the people in the temple. It says in verse 35, it says, as Jesus taught in the temple, he said, how can the scribes say that the Christ is the son of David? David himself in the Holy Spirit declared, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. David himself calls him Lord, so how is he his son? And the great throng heard him gladly. All right, so at the heels of all of this, his authority has been challenged. They've asked him questions. Now Jesus has a question for them. And he's asking them a riddle about the teaching of the Messiah. He's asking them a question about the common belief at the time and the teaching of the scribes that the Messiah would be someone from David's line. The Messiah would be David's heir. And this is coming out of Old Testament Psalms like Psalm 2, Psalm 89. It's coming out of the promise made to David himself in 2 Samuel 7 that someone would be born to him and would reign forever. So Jesus is asking them about this. But then he puts this puzzle to them by quoting Psalm 110. And so I think what he's really doing is he's challenging the idea that the Messiah will merely be yet another king from David's line. So I think he's asking, okay, but isn't this something more than just another human king following David? And so that's sort of the point of what he's asking them. He says, how can the scribes say that the Messiah is the son of David, but then also David himself said, the Lord said to my Lord, so referring to someone greater. So he's pointing to this fact of, okay, if the Messiah is David's descendant, then he should be descended from or beneath or inferior, but yet David is calling him greater. David is calling him his Lord, not his son. He's calling him his Lord. And so Jesus is pointing to Psalm 110 to do this. The interesting thing about Psalm 10, I think it's 110. I think it's worth taking the time just to read the first 4 verses. It says, the Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will offer themselves freely on the day of your power in holy garments from the womb of the morning. The dew of your youth will be yours. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Okay, so not only is this coming Messiah David's heir, he's also David's Lord. He's king. He's of the order of Melchizedek, but he's also priest, which gives him authority in the temple. We talked about that a little bit last week as well. Jesus has, as the Messiah, has authority over Israel and over the temple as well. And so I think part of Jesus' point here is the Messiah is more than he appears. He's not just another human king in the line of David. And then, so I think now we see Jesus has been teaching them what he's come to Jerusalem to do, but now he begins, really for the first time, he begins to kind of reveal the biggest mystery of all. So not only is he the Messiah and king that's coming, he's not only doing this as David's son, but he's doing this as David's Lord. So here Jesus is starting to reveal, starting to teach that in fact, Son of God means something more than just a mere human king. And then this verse, this chapter, Psalm 110, becomes, I think, the most quoted psalm in all the New Testament epistles, because this is what the early Christians look back to when they think of Jesus as more than a man, when they think of him as divine. They're going back to Psalm 110 to establish this as truth. And so the reason I have this last bullet point here is the Messiah is more than he appears. I think that ties into this very next story about the widow's offering. So here in verse 41, Jesus, still in the temple, he says he's sitting across from the treasury. It says he sat down opposite the treasury and he watched the people putting money into the offering box. And there were many rich people, and they put in large sums. And a poor widow came, and she put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And so Jesus called his disciples, and he said to them, truly, I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box. For they contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had to live on. I think the emphasis of everything she had to live on, once she's made this offering, she can't even feed herself. So she's given, in essence, her entire life. She's given her life as a tax or as a sacrifice, a gift to God. And this is happening in the temple where the sacrificial system takes place. And here we have Jesus teaching about a new way, a way where the appropriate way is to give all of oneself. And so, it points out the rich, they put in large sums. The widow, she put in only these 2 small copper coins. But those 2 small copper coins, they're much more than they appear because it's her entire life. It's a complete sacrifice, a complete gift. So just as those 2 coins are more than they appear, I think that's kind of the same point Jesus was making about himself as Messiah. It's more than it appears. And just as the widow's giving up her whole life with these 2 coins, Jesus himself has come to give his entire life. So I think the point of this, as Jesus is about to leave the temple, is that through himself, through the Messiah, God has given himself totally on behalf of his people. So Jesus, just keeping in mind what all's happened here in these chapters, he's come into the temple, he's declared God's judgment on the temple, he's claimed the highest possible authority for doing this. All of this is going to lead to his arrest and execution, but ultimately, he's giving all. He's making the ultimate sacrifice. He's giving his entire life for this mission, for this purpose. And so what will happen to the temple? What will happen to Jesus? I think he's addressing both of these points. But there's this idea of sacrifice and the fact that Jesus is giving himself entirely. And this is going to lead us into chapter 13, which is quite a large discussion in and of itself, but I think this is a good stopping point. If anybody has comments or questions, we can do that now. Okay, we have lots of time for chapter 13. All right, so here, chapter 13. Chapter 13 causes a lot of difficulties because here we have Jesus using some very prophetic language. He's using apocalyptic language. He's using things Christians very much associate with what we think of as the end times or his second coming. And so there's a lot of discussion about, well, what is Jesus talking about here? But before we get into all that, I just want to keep focus on the temple itself and what's happening. So Jesus has been in the temple. He's come looking for fruit. He hasn't found it. Prophesying through God, quoting Old Testament scripture, I believe he's pronounced a judgment on the temple. And that's what he's enacting out sort of when he cleanses the temple. And now here we see in chapter 13, Jesus leaves the temple. And it says, verse 1, and as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." All right, but first I want to focus on he's exiting the temple. So we know from Mark's account he's going to come out the east. This map here, this is a map I took out of one of my Bibles. So he comes out the east side. We know that he heads off towards Bethany and Bethpage, which are over here to the east. But this scene, he's going to come down through the valley of the Kidron Valley here and back up on the Mount of Olives, kind of looking back on the temple from an elevated position. But anyway, Jesus and his disciples have come out to the east, out of the temple. And then his disciples are looking back and commenting on the temple, saying, look, what wonderful stones and what a wonderful building this is. Again, there's a lot of symbolic imagery here, I think, even if you look back to the Old Testament. We just studied Ezekiel. I don't know if that's quite large enough to see, but in Ezekiel we get this prophecy of God and God's Spirit leaving the temple. And it says, this is from Ezekiel 10, 18 and 19. It says, "Then the glory of the Lord went out from the threshold of the house and stood over the cherubim And the cherubim lifted up their wings and mounted up from the earth before my eyes as they went out, with the wheels beside them, and they stood at the entrance of the east gate of the house of the Lord, and the glory of Israel was over them. And then in the next chapter, in Ezekiel 11, it says, and the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood on the mountain that's on the east side of the city, over here, by the Mount of Olives. And so what we have in Ezekiel 10 and 11, the temple has been corrupted and polluted and filled with wickedness and idolatry. And God's leaving the temple. He's leaving his people. And we get, I think, the very real sense Jesus is doing the same thing. God through Jesus, Jesus possessing the full Spirit of God, has come, he's judged the temple, and he's leaving. He's departing the temple. And as he does so, he's going to pronounce a judgment on it. He says, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Oh, yep.
That one stone left on the other. If you believe that Josephus understood exactly what the temple looked like, each stone that he's talking about weighs greater than 1 million pounds. These stones were, if you use the dimensions and assume 18 inches and use concrete at 4,000 psi, it will make it to 1,200 pounds per stone. So when they look back and they say, he tells them this is something that a normal person can't believe could occur. And in fact, the destruction of the temple was only done because it caught on fire and the army melted the gold that was in the walls down to the crevices of these stones, and then they took and tore the stones apart. But this is prophesied roughly 40 years before it occurs.
Mm-hmm. I agree 100%, and thanks for the information on the size of those stones. I think we had a picture of a model of what people think the temple might look like today last week, and I have another slide with that photo again, but we talked about how Josephus, the reason we kind of know what it might have looked like is Josephus wrote about it, and he described what it looked like. And he described how it was covered in gold, and it was very tall, and you could see it from a far distance, and it looked like a white snowy mountain. It was one of the most remarkable buildings in the entire ancient world. It was certainly the pride of the entire nation of Israel at the time. And in terms of just its height alone, I think it must have been the tallest, largest building within hundreds of miles. So there's nothing comparable to it anywhere near it. It's a magnificent structure, and that's why the disciples they're sitting there looking at it and they're saying, "Look how great this is!" Because think about what the disciples came into Jerusalem and what they're expecting. So they've come here. They're wanting to know, well, when are you going to be installed as king? You're the Messiah. When are you going to become king? They came to Jerusalem expecting Jesus to be enthroned as the rightful king, having authority over the temple. And I think in part they're looking back saying, isn't this building that you now have authority over, isn't this magnificent? Isn't it great? And then Jesus turns their whole world upside down and says it's all going to be torn down to the last stone. But I think it's important to keep in mind why they would have asked that question. One, because the building just looked remarkable on its own. But two, they expected Jesus was going to rule this. He's going to have authority over it, and they're going to have a part in it. But Jesus is telling them, no, this is going to happen quite differently. All right, so we get to Mark 13, which I acknowledge is a difficult passage. There's a lot of debate about, is Mark 13 entirely about the destruction of the temple? Certainly these first few verses are. I think that's unquestionable because they ask him, look at this building. He says it's going to be torn down. Then they ask, when will these things happen? So they're asking about the temple. They're asking about what he's just said. But there is language in this passage that Christians associate with the second coming, the end of times, So the question is it talking about the temple, the second coming? Is it both of these things? I think, and I know there are people who will disagree with me, and I know among the broader Christian world, what I'm going to suggest is probably a minority viewpoint. So I'm not claiming to be authoritative on this. I'm giving you my interpretation, but I think context always is important to interpret what the true meaning is. And so here, just looking at the context, I think there's several things to keep in mind about the interpretation here. One is what we just read. This whole chapter begins with a question and a very simple, straightforward prophecy about the temple. Jesus says, yes, it looks magnificent, but it's all going to be torn down. And so the whole chapter begins with that. And so I think that's an obvious point of context that you can't overlook. In verse 4, the disciples ask, they say, when will these things be? So these things they're talking about is the temple being destroyed and torn down to the last stone. Jesus, throughout this chapter, is going to use prophetic language, much of it directly lifted from the Old Testament. So just like with what he did in the temple when he cleansed the temple, when he quoted Old Testament scripture, I think you have to go back and look at that to really see what he means. The other thing is Jesus is describing events that are going to happen to them. So he's going to talk about them being persecuted. He's talking about them. He's talking about the disciples that are with him then. In verse 28, he talks about the fig tree again. And so the fig tree, remember from chapter 11, is sandwiched around this story about the temple. And here Jesus is again invoking the fig tree. So I think very much there's still a connection to the temple, even by verse 28 in this chapter. In verse 30, he says that these things are going to happen in this generation. Okay, so I think by the plain reading of that, either Jesus is wrong about that if he's talking about a second coming and the end of the world, or he's talking about something that does happen in that generation, which is the destruction of the temple. And then, as we talked about this whole class so far, this whole context since we got to chapter 11 has been very temple-focused. So these things, I think, are key to interpreting these passages. Again, that's my opinion, but I think it's important not to overlook that. Now, I think there's a lot of appeal because a lot of this language sounds like what maybe other verses even do talk about a second coming or the end of the world, and it sounds similar. And I think we Christians attach a lot of importance and theological significance to Christ's return and his second coming. I think maybe we don't always attach enough theological significance to what happens to the temple and Jesus' prophecy about it and how that actually vindicates who he is and what he said. So we'll dive into it. Sticking in verse 1 and 2, we were just talking about this model of what people now think Herod's temple might have looked like. But they're pointing this out. Look what wonderful stones. And here Jesus immediately talks about their destruction. I have a verse here from 1 Kings 9 just to point out that if you think about it, the temple in Jerusalem has always been a little ambiguous. God certainly blessed David by allowing his son to build the temple. He blessed Solomon. He promised to fill the temple with his glory. But in 1 Kings 9, when Solomon is dedicating the temple and God talks to Solomon, he gives him a warning. He says, if you turn aside, so if Israel turns aside, God says, I'll abandon this house. This house will become a heap of ruins. And we know ultimately that's what happens in the judgment when Babylon comes in and destroys the first temple. But I pointed out that here because biblically, Jesus has good reason to be talking about the destruction of the temple. So then in verse 4, we get Peter, James, John, and Andrew. They pull Jesus aside and they ask him, when will this be and what will the signs be? And so here Jesus has made sort of a public announcement prophesying against the temple, saying it's going to be torn down. His disciples ask him in private, and then Jesus begins to teach them. And we know that he's doing this on the Mount of Olives with an overlook of the temple and the temple complex. So they're asking him, okay, when is this going to happen? And then we get into some of the signs that Jesus tells them to look for. So we have verse 5. It says, "And Jesus began to explain. He began to say to them, 'See that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and they will lead many astray.'" All right, so Jesus says, okay, well, one sign is there's going to be false prophets. There's going to be false messiahs. We were talking about Josephus a minute ago. Josephus also describes the fact that there were, in fact, several false prophets, false Christs, in the decades between Jesus' death and the destruction of Jerusalem. Acts itself even mentions one of these, a fellow named Judas the Galilean and his sons, and the fact that he had led people astray, but ultimately he died and nothing came of him. Jesus talks here in 7 and 8 to watch out for wars and rumors of wars. We know from Jewish history and from Josephus that there were constant rebellions and threats of rebellions and threats of war against Rome. So all of these things were in fact happening in the decades and in the years leading up to AD 70. Jesus talks about there being earthquakes and famines in verse 8. Again, if you think back to Acts, we have a story in Acts chapter 11 where Agabus is a prophet and he prophesies about a coming great famine. So again, these are things that happened in the decades after Jesus' death, but before the destruction of the temple. And all of these are things that Jesus is saying to watch out for. Continuing on, so in verse 9, this is where he's giving warnings to the specific people with him now. So these are warnings to Peter, James, John, and Andrew, his other apostles. He's talking to them about things that are going to happen to them. So he says, "Be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils." Some versions may over to Sanhedrins, and apparently there was the major Sanhedrin, and there were sort of many Sanhedrins around the country as well. "But deliver them over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them." We know that this stuff happened. Paul himself talks about in his former life when he was Saul that it says in Acts 22, he imprisoned and beat Christians in the synagogues, right? So this stuff is happening. Jesus is telling them all of this is going to happen before. And then he says here that, let's see, in verse 10, it says, "But the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations." That doesn't mean that's not something we're still waiting on. Waiting on the word to spread to every person in the world before God takes this action that Jesus is talking about. This is stuff that happened in the first century. This is stuff that happened in Acts when we read it. If you look at the very beginning of Acts, this is Jesus. He's giving his great commission to them. He tells them, he says, "You're going to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea, in Samaria, and to the end of the earth." That's the charge Jesus gives his church at the very beginning of Acts, is spread this to the end of the earth. It's something that was anticipated to happen then. We know from Acts 2 that on the day of Pentecost, there were men from all nations. We know throughout the book of Acts that Paul was charged with being a witness and bringing the gospel to the Gentiles. Paul brought the gospel to the rest of the world, the non-Jewish world. So again, this is something that we're not looking around still anticipating. This is something that in fact was accomplished in the first century. And then we get this verse here, again with these warnings in verse 12, and he says, "And brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and the children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved." All right, so here Jesus is kind of invoking Micah 6. Micah 6 has very similar language, and it talks about sons turning on fathers, brother turning on brother. Micah 6, in the context of that, it's a prophecy. It's a prophecy about a judgment coming on Israel and the need for God's people to wait for deliverance. Jesus is telling his own disciples something very similar. Judgment's coming. God's people, God's own, are ultimately going to be saved, and they need to wait. So this is still the part of the prophecy where he's telling them to wait. In a moment, he's going to tell them, flee. Now it's time to leave. He encourages them. He says, endure to the end. Again, the word end here, I don't think it means end of the world. This means to bitter end, basically, to the very end, to the uttermost, right through. When all these horrible things are happening to them, Jesus is saying, stick with it, and ultimately you'll be saved. And that's going to be a sign that Jesus is who he said he was, that his church, his disciples are going to survive this catastrophe he's talking about. The temple won't survive, but the church will, his disciples will. All right, verse 14. Keep moving along here. Now we get to the part with the abomination of desolation, which causes a lot of questions, and maybe it's hard to interpret. But these are what I would call specific signs of the impending emergency. So now Jesus is going to start to talk about, all right, I've been talking about this, and remember all this started in verse 2 when he said, I'm talking about the temple, I'm talking about the temple being destroyed. And so here in verse 14 he says, but when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not to be, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who's on the housetop not go down nor enter his house to take anything out, and let the one who's in the field turn back and take his cloak. And alas, for the women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that it may not happen in winter. For in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been seen from the beginning of the creation that God created until now and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it. For false Christ and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead people astray, and if possible, even the elect. But be on guard. I've told you all these things beforehand. So here Jesus gives them a specific sign. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation, then it's time to flee. All right, so these are confusing words. These aren't words we use all the time. I don't typically go around and talk about seeing an abomination or a desolation, certainly not an abomination of desolation. But he talks about the fact that this site will be something that's standing where he ought not to be. And so again, I think the important point to focus on right now is flee. So this is the sign he's talking to them about. He's telling them, I want you to leave. If you go along with the fact that we're talking about the destruction of the temple, he's telling them, get out of Jerusalem. When this begins to happen, leave, because Jesus wants his disciples, his church, to survive this coming cataclysm, this coming catastrophe. So the fall of the temple and the escape of the church, I think, is going to be a sure sign that God has vindicated Jesus as the true Messiah, the true representative of his people. So Jesus, of course, we know from the gospel story, he's going to be tried, he's going to be crucified, he's going to rise again. His resurrection, his ascension, we know, like we're very comfortable saying those things, those are vindicating. Those are vindicating that Jesus truly is the Son of God. This as well, I think, is also yet a further vindication. So there may be people out there, even in that day, who didn't really believe that Jesus had been resurrected. But nobody would be able to look back and say, Jesus prophesied about this happening, and it didn't happen. Because if it didn't happen, then he's just a fraud. He's not who he says he is. But it did happen, and in fact, the church did survive. The church flourished and thrived, we know from Acts chapter 1. And I think all of that, it's important for us to think about when we think about this chapter. That's just a further sign. It's a further vindication that Jesus really is who he said he was. All right, so what about this abomination of desolation? Well, again, here's where you have to look back to the Old Testament to really get an idea of what he's trying to say. This is an idea that shows up in Daniel. It shows up in Daniel chapter 9, chapter 11, chapter 12. It involves pagan symbols, pagan worship in God's temple. The context, I think, in Daniel 9, we have a prayer. Daniel's praying for restoration. He's praying for vindication for God's people. He gets a response from the angel, from Gabriel. The angel tells him that this stuff is coming. And when this stuff comes, it talks about there being an end to sin, and a final atonement, a renewed covenant, rebuilding of the city. It talks about an anointed one who's going to be cut off and have nothing. All right, and keep in mind who Jesus is and what he's come to do. Um, there's going to be troops of a prince that are going to come in and destroy the city and the sanctuary. So this idea of an abomination of desolation has to do with an invading army, a pagan force coming into the very temple itself and setting up something pagan or something idolatrous. There was actually an attempt to do that with Gaius Caligula sometime around 40 AD, I think. He had a plan, and he tried to enact it to put a statue of himself as Zeus, and he was going to erect it within the temple itself. And there was a rebellion and a revolt, and ultimately I think he died or he left power before he could ever make it happen, but it didn't happen. But that would be something they would certainly have recognized had he done it as being an abomination of desolation. The Roman forces themselves, when they came into Jerusalem and they entered the temple complex and they put up the standards of Rome, that could have been seen as that as well. I say all that just to point out that's the sort of thing I think his disciples would hear when he talks about this. But they're going to hear it in the context of Daniel. All right, and so now in verse 24 through 27, we get these verses about the coming of the Son of Man. And here's where Jesus is really digging into the Old Testament prophecy here. So he talks about in verse 24, he says, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. He's using near identical language to Isaiah chapter 13, where it says, the sun will be dark at its rising and the moon will not shed its light. The context of Isaiah 13 is the destruction of Babylon itself. In verse 25 in chapter 13 here, Jesus says, the stars are going to be falling and the powers in heaven will be shaken. Again, this is very similar in the Greek to what Isaiah 34 says. Isaiah 34 is another prophecy of the destruction of a city, the destruction of Edom. There it says a verse that might sound familiar to you. It says, the skies are going to roll up like a scroll, and all their host, all the stars will fall from the sky. The context here is the destruction of Edom. So I think the surprising thing here, Jesus has actually done this before. When he sent his disciples out and he told them that if he sent his disciples out to all these towns and villages throughout Israel, and he said, if they reject you, there's going to be a judgment that comes on them. And he said it would be a judgment like Tyre, Sidon, or Sodom. But here, he's talking about the destruction of the biggest, baddest pagan city in the ancient world, Babylon. And he's applying it to the temple and to Jerusalem. So to me, I think that must have been shocking. Had they if they heard what he's saying and they realized he's pulling right from Isaiah 13 when he says this, those are Babylon words. Those are words that are supposed to be used for Babylon. But here Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple and using those same words. And then in verse 26, he talks about, then you will see. So verse 26 of chapter 13, he says, then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds and from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. All right, so then he brings this image of a Son of Man coming in clouds. Again, I think we have to go back to the Old Testament to see what he's talking about, and back to Daniel specifically. Daniel chapter 7 is the chapter within Daniel that talks about a Son of Man. And in that chapter, the Son of Man comes in the clouds. But I think it's important to read it and realize that what happens in Daniel 7, when the Son of Man comes in the clouds, he's coming to God. So he is coming up in the clouds to be seated next to God at the right hand of God at his throne. That's a vision of a ruler being enthroned, taking power. So as Jesus, talking about himself as the Son of Man, talking about when is it going to happen that he will take full authority, that he will have his rightful place by the Father, he's using language, I think, that must happen at his resurrection and at his ascension when he sits at the right hand of God. And he's invoking the authority that comes along with that. And he's saying, I will be at the right hand of the Son of God. I have come into the clouds. I have the authority as the Messiah and the ruler over all the kingdoms of the earth. And I think he's going back to Daniel chapter 7 to invoke that picture. But what he's saying here is what's happening. My interpretation is this destruction of the temple is a vindication that he is who he says he is, that his rightful place is at the right hand of God in the clouds with all the authority that comes with that. All right, so to me, I still think all of this up through verse 27 at least is still talking about the temple. We have a verse in verse 27 that says he's going to send out angels and gather his elect from the four winds and the ends of the earth and to the ends of heaven. Remember the verse we just looked at in Acts chapter 1? Jesus is sending out his disciples, his messengers, his angels. He's saying, be my witnesses to the ends of the earth, and they're gathering people into God's church, into God's elect. To me, I think that's a fair interpretation of that as well. And then in verse 28, we get back to the fig tree, which for me is more confirmation that we're still talking about the temple. Because in chapter 11, we have the fig tree sandwich, and it's very centered around the judgment and prophecy against the temple. And here, Jesus is going back to the fig tree. He says, from the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So he talks about the fig tree, and he says that these things are going to happen in this generation. So again, I think he's used figurative language, but here you can take him at face value when he says these prophecies will happen in this generation. Verse 32 through 36, we'll read it just for completeness. It says, but concerning that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come. It's like a man going on a journey, and when he leaves home, he puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore stay awake, for you don't know when the master of the house will come in the evening, or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to you all is stay awake. So here and throughout this, Jesus has been, I think, anticipating a time where he won't be there anymore with his disciples, but that these things he's talking about will still be taking place. They're still going to be in some danger. He's telling them to stay awake, to stay the course, to endure to the end, is what he said earlier. Again, these are my interpretations. I've left you about 30 seconds. so I don't know that if you have any serious questions, I don't know that we'll resolve them. I'm not claiming to be an authority. I'm happy to talk about it with anyone, but we got through chapter 13. Those are, in my opinion, most, if not all of it, is still talking about the temple. And I think it serves us well to think about Jesus' prophecy of the temple and its ultimate fulfillment as just further vindication that Jesus really is